Thanks, everybody, for coming. I think John wanted me to start with a couple of selections. Actually, sort of the bookends of the book, the first paragraph of the book, and a selection from the final chapter of the book. I hope that even if you find out what happens in the end, you'll still consider buying it. This is from the prologue. Eliphaz Laki wasn't coming home. Duncan knew it. Everybody knew it. But hope was an obstinate emotion. It dug into Duncan like a tick, feeding off the doubts his rational mind couldn't quite extinguish. There were rumors, third-hand tales told in hushed voices. His father was in hiding, in exile. He'd been sighted in Tanzania. A rebel army was forming there, across the river to the south. The stories didn't make sense to Duncan, though. He knew his father loved his family. He would have found a way to send word. Duncan heard other, darker whispers, too. Some said Laki had been taken by soldiers and shot. But there was no body, and there had been no burial, no inquest, no explanation. Eliphaz Laki had disappeared, and his son was left with hope. Stubborn, secret, maddening hope. So that's the way the book begins, and here's the way the last chapter begins. Eliphaz Laki did come home. His funeral took place in Indasia, the village where he grew up, outside the yellow-painted farmhouse he built back when he was a chief. More than 1,000 people attended the ceremony. They began to arrive at mid-morning, peasant women with babies strapped to their backs, their bare feet dusty from a long journey, gray-haired men dressed in their best safari suits. In an adjacent pasture, longhorn cattle grazed next to parked Mercedes and Land Rovers, vehicles belonging to government dignitaries who had come to pay their final respects. Many of those in attendance had never known Eliphaz Laki. They just read about the case in the newspaper. All day, gray rain clouds loomed ominously overhead, but somehow the weather held. And then this is from the actual last paragraph of the book. After Laki is actually buried. From the top of this hill, this ripple of the Western Rift, you could take in the whole of Indasia. You could trace the thin reddish path of the road where a chief, riding in his Studebaker, first caught sight of a poor boy named Eliphaz Laki. You could look down on the bright red roof of the farmhouse Laki built for his family, the place where his young son imagined a homecoming. You could survey the valley, dense with lush green foliage, where Duncan's mother had taken cover during the invasion of 1979. You could just glimpse the meandering Orise River, where vengeance was once meted out with machetes. And you could recall that there was a time before Yoweri Museveni and Idi Amin, before the betrayals and the reprisals, before colonialism and Christianity, and the collision of uncomprehending worlds. A time when the river used to flood, cutting the village in half and dividing its people. That was why it was called Indasia. I'll come back. As you stood there, at the top of Eliphaz Laki's hill, next to his grave, you could imagine that perhaps this was all the justice he would have desired.
I wanted Andrew to read that last paragraph in particular because when I got to the end of the book, actually read it several times because Andrew covers so much terrain in that last paragraph, both literally and symbolically, especially historically. Not only, the time during which the key events in the book take place, Eliphaz Laki disappears in 1979. In 1999, his son Duncan uncovers a key clue that leads to an investigation of his father's disappearance. You arrived in Uganda in 2002, Andrew, correct?
Yes.
And then in November of that year, or in August of that year, you read about a trial taking place in a newspaper, and it's a trial for the people who've been alleged of and who were involved in the disappearance of Elifaz Lachi. Trial begins in November and then ends in September of the following year. But that's set against this huge past, not only of Uganda in the 20th century, but also its colonial history and even its not prehistoric history, but there are sections in the book where you go real far back. And one thing I was curious about is, I mean, that last paragraph, you really feel the presence of the past. And it's something you managed to evoke very clearly and subtly in the book. I'm curious to know, you know, if you were aware of that when you arrived in 2002, and if not, how you came to grasp how you would go about telling this story that seems so much about the past as much as the present.
Well, I certainly didn't know very much about Uganda when I went to live there in 2002. I went there actually under the auspices of a foundation called the Institute of Current World Affairs, which is based in, at the time it was based in Hanover, New Hampshire, now it's in DC. But basically they give grants to people, young people, to go and live in foreign countries and write about them. And I, you know, had never been to Africa before. But I was interested. I was working as a journalist here in New York, and I was interested in doing something, you know, different. You know, they sent me there. Basically, I mean, my proposal for the foundation was, you know, it wasn't quite, you know, I don't know anything about this place. Please send me, and I'll find out. But that was essentially sort of what the pitch was, and I guess in a way I was looking for a way to understand the place better, and I wrote a lot of other things while I was there. But really, this trial and this story was sort of my avenue into understanding Uganda. It did not come from some pre-existing understanding that I could situate all these events in. So, you know, when you talk about the book, in a way, traces, I guess, my own sort of process of discovery, in that, you know, it starts off more or less in the present day,
right? And
then it's really only over the course of time that you go back into the history and discover, well, you know, that there are complications to the history that don't necessarily appear on the surface, but in a way impact the events that are described.
well, another reason I was interested in the way you evoke the presence of the past is because the story you tell about events that occurred while you are there from 2002 to 2005 is very much a history of forgetting that is ongoing in some parts of Uganda. And I'm thinking in particular of a good example of this is something you mention in a note, but I think is really significant for understanding the story you tell, and that's a report that was written in 1973 of the Commission of Inquiry. Curious to know, one, how you learned about that report, since so much of what you talk about in the book is about people forgetting. And here we have a report, Amin is still in office. It's an inquiry into things that occurred on his watch. How did that
It's occur? Really an extraordinary story. There was basically the background is, and for people who don't necessarily know a whole lot about the big picture background, I mean, Amin took power in a coup in 1971, was overthrown in 1979, and Elifaz Lachi, the person whose disappearance is at the center of the book, disappeared in 1972 during like the first really strong wave of reprisals against people who were opposing the government. In the midst of all this, Amin, when he first came to power, was actually sort of hailed by, among others, the British, as being this kind of, you know, populist who would know how to run Uganda better than the guy who was deposed, who was sort of a leftist, had ruled in a not overly brutal but pretty corrupting, craven way. And it was only over a course of time that it became apparent that Amin was like this monster that we now know today from movies and so on.